I found a brass cylinder sealed inside the engine compartment of a 1936 Gar Wood triple cockpit runabout, and inside was my late husband's unmistakable handwriting warning me not to trust his brother. Now that brother-in-law varnishes hulls for me in a bright orange shirt that reads "Sunk my trust," and every single rental receipt from Wake of Deceit boats prints the federal fraud docket that ended his freedom. This is how I dismantled a man who thought he could forge a dissolution, steal an $830,000 fleet of restored wooden speedboats, and hand me a $5,500 check like I was a disoriented old widow who wouldn't notice. My name is Clara, and I am a retired cardiac ICU nurse, 32 years on the night shift at St. Mary's Hospital, where you learn to read a person's dishonesty in the way they breathe before they even open their mouth. The ventilator alarms teach you to separate panic from precision, and the endless charting teaches you that if it isn't written down in ink, it never happened. I carried that lesson into every single thing I did after I hung up my scrubs. My husband Jack was a master carpenter who could look at a rotten plank of mahogany and see the boat it wanted to become. We had no children, just a small cottage on a glacial lake in northern Michigan, and a shared obsession with wooden boats from the golden age of speed. When I liquidated my nursing pension, $108,000 after taxes and penalties and 32 years of night differentials, we did not buy a motorhome or book a Mediterranean cruise. We drove to barns and backyards all over the Midwest and bought abandoned hulls. A 1936 Gar Wood 22-foot triple cockpit runabout, its deck soft with dry rot, and its original Chrysler Crown straight-8 engine seized solid. A 1939 Chris Craft 19-foot barrel back with its port side stove in from a trailer accident. A 1942 Hacker craft that still had its original Scripps V12, a miracle of engineering covered in mouse nests. Two tiny Dodge watercars from 1928 that looked like wooden bathtubs with steering wheels. Jack handled the wood, scarfing new planks into old with compound angles, so precise you could run a fingernail over the seam and feel nothing. I taught myself marine engine rebuilding from a Sharp manual, printed in 1947, learned to pour Babbitt bearings and lap valves by hand, and mastered the 16-coat varnish process that requires each coat to be sanded with 400 grit paper, wiped with a tack cloth, and applied in a dust-free environment at exactly 68 degrees. We turned an old pole barn into a climate-controlled finishing bay, and we worked side by side for 4 years, until the fleet gleamed like poured honey under the high bay lights. The business was legally mine as the sole capital investor, but we structured it as a partnership because Jack's younger brother Keith needed a lifeline. Keith was the golden child, the one their mother had always bailed out, and he had just emerged from his second personal bankruptcy, this time from a failed franchise sandwich shop that left him with $140,000 in unsecured debt and a wife with expensive taste. Lorna was a former pharmaceutical sales rep who treated empathy like a stain on her silk blouse. She and Keith lived in a 5-bedroom colonial 40 minutes away, a house they could not afford, and they leased 2 luxury SUVs. When Jack asked me to give Keith a stake, I did not argue because I trusted Jack's judgment. We had a lawyer draft a partnership agreement for Heritage Craft Rentals, granting Keith a 40% ownership interest in exchange for his agreement to manage the rental bookings, the dock maintenance, and the customer relations, none of which required him to invest a single dollar. I added a clause that I insisted on personally. Section 8(2) stated that any dissolution of the partnership required the unanimous written consent of all partners, physically notarized together in each other's presence, using blue ink that could be distinguished from a photocopy. I added it because I had watched a colleague lose her family business to a forged signature, and I was not going to let that happen. I also included a sweetener, a lifetime of free Sunday cruises for my family for the life of the business, because I wanted our lake to be a place of joy. Keith signed in blue ink at a coffee shop on Dark Street, a mobile notary stamped her seal, and I filed the original in our fire safe, or so I thought. Jack died on a Tuesday morning in early May, his heart deciding that 61 years was enough. He was sanding a transom in the pole barn, and he simply stopped. The coroner said it was a massive occlusion, instantaneous, no suffering. The grief was a black curtain I could not see past, could not breathe through, could not push aside long enough to eat or sleep. His funeral was held at the little lakeside chapel where we used to sit in the back pew and hold hands during the Christmas service. The pastor read from Ecclesiastes, and I sat in the front row numb, while the organist played a hymn I did not hear. Before the last cloud of dirt had settled on his grave, Keith and Lorna were already circling. They arrived at my cottage the morning after the funeral, Lorna carrying a foil-covered casserole and a crisp manila folder, Keith with a box of donuts and a smile that did not reach his eyes. "We're here to take care of everything, Clara," Lorna cooed, her voice dripping with a concern I had never once seen her display for anyone. "You shouldn't have to worry about paperwork right now." While I sat in the living room clutching a cold cup of tea, they went through Jack's workshop and his personal effects upstairs. I heard drawers opening and closing, rapid footsteps, the low murmur of their voices. After about 20 minutes, Keith came down holding a battered wooden box, the one Jack kept his old Coast Guard pins and his grandfather's pocket watch in. "This is just junk, Clara," he said, tilting it so I could see a tangle of fishing lures and a mildewed copy of Chapman's piloting. "I'll toss it out with the trash." I nodded weakly, watched him set it by the back door next to the recycling bin. The moment their car pulled out of the driveway, I retrieved it. The box was heavier than it should have been, and when I pressed the velvet lining inside the lid, I felt a slight give. Under a false bottom, fitted so precisely that only someone who knew Jack's woodworking would think to look, I found a small brass key and a folded piece of paper. The paper was yellowed but crisp, and on it in Jack's square draftsman's hand were 8 words. "Clara, the Gar Wood's bilge holds more than water. Use it. I love you. Do not trust them. Save yourself." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that the people closest to you can sometimes be the most dangerous, and that a paper trail can outlast a liar's smile. Now, I will walk you through exactly how I burned their scheme to the waterline. The morning after the funeral, Keith and Lorna arrived with coffee, almond croissants from the expensive bakery in town, and a stack of documents that would have required a team of paralegals to draft on such a short timeline. They sat me at the kitchen table, Lorna to my left, Keith directly across, a classic interrogation configuration whether they knew it or not. The central document was a durable power of attorney, coupled with a dissolution of the partnership and a bill of sale for the entire boat fleet. The stated consideration for the sale of my 60% share and the entire business was $5,500. $5,500. I read the number twice, my nursing brain automatically checking for a misplaced decimal point, but there it was. Keith explained that the Lakeview Grand, a new luxury resort that had been courting classic boat operators along the shoreline, had made a verbal offer of $830,000 for the fleet, contingent on clear title and immediate transfer. "But the partnership needs to be dissolved first, Clara, and since you're clearly in no emotional state to handle any of this, I'm going to take care of it. I'll handle the resort, I'll handle the boats, and you can take this check and go somewhere warm for a while. You've earned it." He slid a cashier's check across the table, the kind that looks official and permanent. I stared at it. I owned 60% of a 6-boat fleet valued at $830,000. Even if you applied discount rates for a distressed sale, my share was worth just under $500,000. The math was so insultingly wrong that I felt the first cold thread of clarity cut through my grief. I let my hands tremble a little, which was easy because they were already trembling from exhaustion, and I said in my most exhausted, defeated nurse's voice, "I just can't think right now, Keith. Can we talk about this next week? I need to rest." He and Lorna exchanged that look, the one that says the prey is too weak to run, too foggy to read the fine print. They agreed immediately, but they insisted, with a show of familial concern that was almost convincing, that I move into their guest house so they could keep an eye on me and make sure I was eating. I said yes. I needed inside their walls, and I needed them to believe I was broken. The guest house was a converted garage behind their main house, a single room with a kitchenette, a bath, and one window that faced Keith's home office across a strip of lawn. I unpacked a single bag, set a framed photo of Jack on the nightstand, and began the quiet, methodical work of a woman who had once kept a patient alive by manually squeezing a Roman IV bag for 17 minutes during a power outage, while the backup generator failed to start. I knew how to wait, how to observe, and how to document. The first red flag came within 48 hours. Lorna did not know I could hear every word spoken in their kitchen through the guest house ventilation grate, a quirk of the ductwork that channeled sound as clearly as a stethoscope. On the second night at 2 a.m, I lay still in the dark and listened to her on the phone, her voice a frayed wire of panic. "I don't care what Dominic says, the balloon payment is due in 18 days, and if we don't have the signed dissolution, the resort's legal team won't release the escrow. Keith is working on her. She's mush. She can't even remember to put sugar in her tea. Relax. Balloon payment. Escrow. I filled a small spiral notebook with these fragments, using a penlight under the covers like a child reading after bedtime, except I was recording the anatomy of a fraud. I started cataloguing their financial mayhem methodically. Keith spent hours pacing his office, phone jammed to his ear, shouting words like UCC lien and title encumbrance and portfolio cross-collateralization at some poor bank officer who was clearly not giving him the answer he wanted. I could see him through the window, his face reddening, his free hand slashing the air. Lorna, meanwhile, was spending money as if the escrow had already cleared. A delivery truck arrived with a $17,000 Italian leather sectional, the kind that curves in a crescent and seats 12, which she installed in a living room that already had 3 sofas. A landscape architect came to give an estimate on a koi pond. She paid for it all with credit cards, I guessed, because I found a shredded American Express statement in their recycling bin that I pieced back together on the guest house floor, the numbers still legible through the cross-cut strips. The statement showed a total revolving balance of $41,000, with a minimum payment that was 3 times their likely monthly income. They were drowning, and I was their life raft. I played my part with a precision that would have earned me a commendation from the hospital's acting coach, the one who trained us to deliver bad news to families. I shuffled to breakfast in a threadbare bathrobe and slippers. I let my hair go flat and unwashed. I paused mid-sentence as though I had forgotten what I was saying, staring into the middle distance. I asked Lorna to repeat simple instructions. To them, I was a dull-eyed widow who couldn't balance a checkbook, a liability they were managing until they could harvest my signature. But every night after the main house lights went out at 10:30, I locked the guest house door and worked. I sat with my laptop in the bathroom, the only room without a window facing the main house, the exhaust fan masking any sound. I reconstructed their finances from the fragments I had collected. The shredded Amex statement told me their credit card number and payment history. A yellow post-it note I found stuck to the underside of Keith's desk blotter, discovered while I was pretending to look for a tissue in his office, listed a password for his home Wi-Fi network. That password gave me access to their local network, and from there I discovered that Keith had left an old tablet logged into a cloud storage account. The tablet was in a kitchen drawer, covered in flour and dead batteries. I charged it, accessed the cloud folder labeled Heritage Lick, and found a digital treasure chest of criminal intent. Inside that folder were scanned copies of a forged dissolution agreement, the same document they wanted me to sign. The forgery was clumsy. The signature on my line swirled in a reasonable facsimile of my handwriting, but with my name misspelled as Clara. The notary seal was a color photocopy, not embossed. There was also a letter from a bank officer at a regional credit union, discussing the use of the boats as collateral for a separate $400,000 line of credit that Keith and Lorna had already drawn down to $387,000. The letter mentioned a balloon payment due in 21 days, a floating interest rate that had climbed to 18%, and a warning that failure to extend or refinance would trigger immediate default and asset seizure. The boats were the collateral, but they did not legally own the boats yet. They had lied to the bank, likely presenting a forged partnership document to show full ownership, and now they needed my real signature to make the fraud retroactively true before the bank's examiner caught on. They were using my fleet to secure a loan they had already spent, and the resort sale was their only way to clear the debt and pocket the difference. I printed every document to a portable PDF, saved backups to 3 different cloud accounts, and began keeping a detailed log of dates, times, and observations in a password-protected file. The household accident that proved my competence and their helplessness came 3 days later. I was in the main house kitchen when Lorna's garbage disposal jammed, a horrible grinding noise followed by a burning smell. She immediately began shouting for Keith, who came down and poked at the reset button with a butter knife, achieving nothing. I stood there in my bathrobe watching them flap, and then I quietly walked to the breaker panel, shut off the circuit, went to the sink, and used an Allen wrench from the utility drawer to manually rotate the disposal's flywheel from underneath until the blockage freed. I fished out a chicken bone, reset the breaker, and the disposal hummed to life. They stared at me. I fixed the hospital's food service disposal for years, I said, shrugging, and shuffled away. They dismissed it as a fluke, but I saw the flicker of unease in Lorna's eyes. I was not supposed to know how to do anything useful. The critical physical evidence was still missing, the original partnership agreement. Jack's note had pointed me to the Gar Wood's bilge, but I needed a plausible excuse to leave the compound. 2 days later, I convinced Lorna I needed a quiet drive to remember Jack, to visit the place where we worked together. She was reluctant, but I played the grief card heavily, my voice cracking, and she relented on the condition that I take her cell phone so she could reach me. I took the phone, but I left it in the glove box of my car while I drove alone to our boat storage facility, a long steel building on the edge of the lake where the restored fleet sat on custom trailers under canvas covers. The air inside was cool and smelled of varnish and old gasoline. I pulled back the canvas cover on the 1936 Gar Wood, the flagship of our fleet. 22 feet of hand-rubbed mahogany, triple cockpits upholstered in oxblood leather, the deck hardware polished to a mirror finish, the engine compartment hatch lifted on solid brass hinges that Jack had machined himself. Inside, the Chrysler Crown straight-eight sat silent, its green enamel block gleaming. I had rebuilt this engine myself, cylinder by cylinder, and I knew every nut and wire. The note had said the bilge holds more than water. I ran my hand along the engine stringers, the heavy timber frames that supported the motor, and in the bilge, painted black to blend with the accumulated oil and dirt, I found a brass cylinder about 6 inches long, sealed with a threaded cap. I used the brass key from the wooden box which fit a small slot in the cap to unscrew it. Inside, rolled tightly and wrapped in a Ziploc bag, was the original notarized partnership agreement. I unrolled it with shaking hands. There was Keith's signature in blue ink, the 40% clause, the lifetime Sunday cruise provision, and Section 8. 2, the dissolution clause I had insisted on. And at the bottom in Jack's handwriting was a note that made my heart stop. Clara, I filed UCC-1 financing statements on every hull at the county recorder's office. The partnership is listed as the secured party. No sale or encumbrance can happen without a physical notarized release signed by you in original blue ink. This agreement is the root of title. Protect it. I knew he would try. I'm sorry. I love you. Jack, a man who never finished high school, had somehow taught himself enough commercial law to file a uniform commercial code financing statement, a legal record that publicly declares a security interest in property. He had walked into the county clerk's office, forms in hand, and filed a UCC-1 for each boat, naming the partnership itself as the lender and the boats as the collateral. It was a dead man's switch, a legal booby trap. If Keith tried to sell the boats, a title search would reveal the UCC filings, and any buyer's lender would demand a release of lien signed by me personally, with my signature compared to the one on file. The forged dissolution with misspelled Clara and black photocopy ink would never pass a title company's scrutiny. Jack had essentially made me the gatekeeper of my own assets from beyond the grave, and he had done it without telling me, probably to spare me the worry. I sat in that empty storage building and cried for 10 minutes, not just from grief, but from a furious, grateful love for the man who had spent his last months quietly building a fortress around me. Now I needed to activate the legal machinery. I could not simply walk into the closing and waive the agreement. I needed an ally inside the resort's corporate structure, someone who would understand the stakes and coordinate a controlled takedown. I researched the Lakeview Grand's executive team online, using the guest house Wi-Fi, and identified the senior vice president of acquisitions and legal compliance. Her name was Elena Markov, and her LinkedIn profile listed 12 years as a federal bank regulator with the office of the comptroller of the currency before she transitioned to hospitality. That resume told me 2 things. She knew fraud when she saw it, and she had the regulatory contacts to act. I purchased a prepaid burner phone from a big box store 20 miles away, paid cash, and called the resort's main switchboard from a parking lot. I asked for Ms. Markov's office and was transferred 3 times, each time repeating that I had information about a potential fraud involving a fleet acquisition. Finally, a warm, precise voice came on the line. I identified myself without preamble and laid out the facts in the same clinical tone I once used to present a crashing patient's vitals to an attending physician. Ms. Markov, my name is Clara. I am the 60% owner of Heritage Craft Rentals. Your resort has made an offer of $830,000 for my fleet. My brother-in-law Keith is attempting to sell you those boats using a forged dissolution agreement, and he has also used those boats as collateral for a separate loan that is in default. I hold the original partnership agreement, filed UCC-1 statements, and a cloud folder full of his financial planning documents. I need your help to structure a closing that will expose him in front of law enforcement without tipping him off. There was a long silence, then the sound of a door closing, and Elena's voice sharpened with interest. If what you're telling me is true, we have a mandatory fraud reporting obligation to our title insurer, and potentially to the FBI if wire communications cross state lines. I can arrange a controlled closing. I will have a title agent, a notary, and a sheriff's deputy in the room. You will present the original partnership agreement in person. We do not close until you personally verify your identity and sign with blue ink. But I need you to understand, you will be walking into a room with a man who has already committed multiple felonies. Are you willing to do that? Yes, but first I needed one final test. I needed to be absolutely certain that no sliver of family loyalty was left to infect my resolve, so I staged a medical crisis. It was a Sunday morning, 6 days before the scheduled closing. I had spent the previous night copying all my evidence to a thumb drive and mailing a backup to my former hospital's legal department with instructions to open in the event of my death. I walked into the main house kitchen, where Keith and Lorna were arguing over a credit card statement that showed an overdue balance of $41,000 on their American Express. I poured myself a glass of water from the dispenser on the refrigerator door, and then I collapsed. Not a graceful faint. I used every bit of my 32 years of watching dying patients to mimic a sudden cardiac event. I let my knees buckle, the glass shattered on the tile floor, and I fell sideways with my limbs splayed, my face turned so I could see through barely slit eyelids. I made my breathing shallow and irregular, the agonal gasping that means the heart has stopped pumping effectively. Lorna screamed, but Keith, my brother-in-law, the man I had given a 40% stake in my life's work, did not call 911. He did not check my pulse, he did not drop to his knees and start chest compressions, which he had been trained to do when he took a CPR class I personally arranged 5 years earlier. He stepped right over my unconscious body, his loafer brushing my forearm, to snatch a document from the counter. It was the check that needed my signature. He said in a voice of pure irritation, "Not now, Clara." As if I were a malfunctioning appliance that had chosen the wrong moment to break. Lorna eventually dialed 911 after I let out a manufactured groan and feigned returning to consciousness, and I told the paramedics it was just a dizzy spell from low blood sugar. They checked my vitals, which were rock steady because I had been faking, and left. But I had my answer. The man who was my husband's brother had just demonstrated, beyond any possible appeal, that he would watch me die on his kitchen floor if my death made his debt go away. The last filament of family loyalty in my heart went cold. The closing was set for a Wednesday afternoon at 3 p.m. in a conference room at the Lakeview Grand's legal offices. Keith told me we were going to finalize the sale so you can get your share and finally relax, Clara. He had the forged dissolution documents in a leather portfolio, a notary he had paid $200 cash to look the other way, and a smugness that I could practically smell. I dressed in a frumpy beige cardigan, let my hair lie in limp grey strands, and carried a worn canvas tote bag that contained a manila folder with copies of his forged papers that he had given me earlier. I did not tell him what else that bag contained, wedged beneath a folded scarf. As we drove to the resort in Keith's leased SUV, Lorna chirped about the new sunroom they were going to build with the proceeds, and Keith kept patting my knee. "You're doing the right thing, sis. Jack would have wanted us to take care of you." I nodded, staring out the window at the lake, and said nothing. We walked into the conference room, a glass-walled space overlooking the marina where the resort's new docks were already being installed. Elena Markov was seated at the head of a polished walnut table. To her right sat a title agent from a respected national company, a woman with a leather-bound binder and a magnifying loupe. To her left was a stern-looking man in a sport coat who I correctly pegged as a county sheriff's deputy, his badge visible on his belt. Keith did not notice them, not really. He was too busy arranging his notary, a nervous young man with a stamp and spreading his forged dissolution across the table. He handed me a pen, a cheap ballpoint with blue ink. "Sign here, Clara, blue ink, please, then we can all go home." I looked at the line, the misspelled Clara, the signature I knew had been traced from an old greeting card I had signed years ago. I set the pen down. I opened my canvas tote and removed the brass cylinder, still smelling faintly of bilge and varnish. I unscrewed the cap in full view of everyone, took out the rolled original partnership agreement, and laid it flat on the table next to his forgery. The paper crackled as it uncurled. "You forgot one thing, Keith," I said, and my voice was no longer the frail whisper of a grieving widow. It was the steady, factual tone of a charge nurse correcting a resident who was about to administer the wrong medication. "The partnership agreement you signed in front of a notary 6 years ago contains Section 8(2), which requires unanimous written consent for dissolution. That consent must be executed in the physical presence of all partners, using original blue ink. My name is not Clara, and that is not my signature. It is a photocopied forgery. Furthermore, my husband, your brother, filed UCC-1 financing statements on every hull in this fleet. Those filings mean the boats are legally encumbered by the partnership, and any sale without my physically present, notarized consent is void ab initio. I tapped the original agreement. This is the root of title. That is a fraudulent document. And I have a cloud storage folder containing your planning documents, your balloon loan statements, your wife's 2 a.m., confession to wire fraud, and a scanned copy of the exact forgery you just placed on this table. Deputy, I believe you have enough probable cause to make an arrest. The deputy stood. Keith looked from the original agreement to my face, and I watched his expression cycle through confusion, recognition, and finally a white-hot rage that collapsed instantly into abject terror. His mouth opened and closed. Lorna lunged for the forgery on the table, but the title agent already had her hand on it, pulling it toward herself. Keith stammered something about a misunderstanding, about how I was confused, about how this was all a mix-up with the bank. Elena Markov recited from memory, Title 18, Section 1344 of the United States Code, the bank fraud statute, and informed him that the resort was formally reporting the incident to the FBI's white-collar crime division, as the wire communications involving the resort's out-of-state bank triggered federal jurisdiction. The deputy moved around the table and placed Keith in handcuffs, reading him his rights in a calm voice, while Lorna screamed about how I was ruining the family, how I was a greedy, paranoid old woman who had never loved Jack. I picked up the original partnership agreement, smoothed its curled edge, and slid it back into the brass cylinder. I had one more thing to do before I left. I reached into my purse and took out the $5,500 cashier's check, still uncashed, the one he had slid across my kitchen table weeks ago. I folded it in half and tucked it into the breast pocket of Keith's shirt as the deputy guided him past me. For your legal defense, I said, consider it a severance package. You're going to need it. The legal fallout was swift because I had built a case that a first-year prosecutor could win with one hand tied behind their back. The FBI's white-collar unit took the referral, and within weeks, a federal grand jury indicted Keith on 5 counts including wire fraud, bank fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and attempted grand theft. Lorna was indicted as a co-conspirator, though her charges were eventually pled down to a single count of misprision of a felony for failing to report. Within 4 months, Keith accepted a plea deal. He pleaded guilty to 1 count of bank fraud and 1 count of conspiracy to commit wire fraud. The judge sentenced him to 3 years of federal probation, 100 hours of community service, and full financial restitution to me in the amount of $830,000, representing the value of the fleet he had attempted to steal. The restitution order was filed as a civil judgment, and because he and Lorna had already burned through every liquid asset, the bankruptcy trustee seized their house, their cars, the Italian sectional, and even Lorna's jewelry collection. The family photos from their hallway ended up in a public auction lot. Here is where the procedural elegance truly locked into place, and I must credit my lawyer, a fierce woman named Joanne who had the soul of a poet and the brain of a tax accountant. Because the restitution order named me as the direct victim, and because the criminal judgment was accompanied by a civil judgment for the fraudulent dissolution, the court determined that Keith's 40% ownership interest in the partnership was, in effect, an asset that could be attached to satisfy part of the debt. But he could not sell it, because the partnership agreement required my consent to transfer, and I would never consent. He could not borrow against it because the UCC1 filings clouded any lender's security interest. He was trapped. He still owned 40% of a business that was now worth more than $1 million, but he could not touch a single penny. Instead, the court approved a creative sentence modification, negotiated by Joanne, that allowed Keith to work off his restitution through direct labor. He would work for Heritage Craft Rentals, under my direct supervision, performing all hull maintenance, sanding, and varnishing. His court-mandated wage was set at $15 an hour, with 75% of every paycheck garnished toward the restitution debt. I recalculated the math on a yellow legal pad. At that rate, after factoring in the principal and the accumulating interest, it would take him approximately 37 years to pay me back. 37 years of sanding mahogany in a dusty boathouse, while I ran the business from a clean office overlooking the lake. I renamed the business Wake of Deceit Boats, and I leaned into the absurd poetry of the situation with the same meticulous energy I had once poured into 16 coats of varnish. The first thing I ordered was a custom work shirt for my new employee, bright safety orange, with black block letters across the back that read, "Sunk My Trust." In smaller print underneath, I added his full name and the docket number of his federal fraud case. He is required to wear it at all times while on the premises, a condition of his probation. I installed a new point-of-sale system that prints a line at the bottom of every rental receipt. It reads, "This business is operated under court order. Former partner Keith, case No. 2, 23 CR 00187, was convicted of bank fraud and attempted theft of this fleet. He is currently serving a restitution sentence through on-site labor." Just in case any renter wonders why the man in the orange shirt is sanding a transom with a defeated stare, they can read the docket for themselves. Today, the fleet is worth more than ever. The Gar Wood still runs like a dream, its Chrysler Crown engine purring at exactly 600 RPM at idle, the way I tuned it myself. I run the Sunday cruises now, and I invite the nurses from my old unit, the ones who worked the night shift with me and know the value of a steady hand. Sometimes Elena Markov comes up from the resort, and we take the Chriscraft out and talk about fraud detection systems and best practices for identity verification. Keith varnishes hulls 6 days a week in a separate boathouse at the far end of the property, a building with no heat and no radio, just racks of clamps and the endless smell of two-part marine varnish. When tourists ask him about his shirt, he is required, per our written agreement with the probation office, to explain exactly what he did. He has to say the words out loud every single time. I keep the brass cylinder on a shelf in my office, next to Jack's photo and a framed copy of the original partnership agreement. On hard days when the grief still rolls in like fog off the lake, I unscrew the cap and read his note again. "Do not trust them, save yourself." He knew. He built the defense into the very hull of the boat and he trusted me to find it. Integrity is not a passive virtue. It is a structure you build, plank by plank, with the same precision you use to scarf a mahogany joint or mix a batch of two-part varnish. You reinforce it against dry rot, you check the fasteners when no one is looking, and you document every step because the paper trail is your only real insurance. My husband spent his life working with wood that would devour itself if left unsealed, and he understood that some people are the same way. The Keiths of the world move through life with a putty knife, spackling over their frauds and hoping no one looks too closely at the grain. But wood doesn't lie, and neither does ink. The only lasting protection against a liar is a record so tight they hang themselves on the dotted line, with their own pen in their own hand, while the notary watches. Have you ever discovered a dark secret about someone you trusted completely? How did you handle it? I want to read your stories in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you believe that trust is earned every single day, not just assumed, and if you love the sound of a wooden boat's engine waking up at dawn. Thanks for watching, and as I tell my rental folks before they cast off, keep an eye on the weather and never let someone else hold the title to your hull. I'll see you next time.